The inevitable need of asserting market price is derivative of calculating the collective community's ability to exchange in the various resources, requiring the building of the customers, which, as a function of the brokerage, which at the first layer is creating the trades, including the construction of the customers of future layers in the development of the various businesses. You have a system of profits which have to be calculated, and thus the projection in question certifies the various layers, which asserts the 800 billion traded up to 7 layers, finishing on the kingdom layer, where the treaties are being engaged with, which was necessary to David's trades with the Slavic coalition, which would have asserted his treaty with Russia and Ukraine, dissolving the threat by blocking the Confederates from their proxy war threats, prompting Russia to engage in the various exchanges. And this, as a general idea, is why the Confederates hate David's character, or the legend of David, so deeply, because he is fundamentally their opposite. He is the direct cure to their corruption. At which point you have the certification of the various trades on the first layer, such as David stopping the crash of '08, which trades up to the 6th layer, which includes David's national security functions as intelligence oversight as the top-ranking general, which includes David stopping the 9/11 attacks, which he found in his projections, doing the air security for 9/11 without following the orders by the Confederates to turn it off, which is discoverable inside the record. If you can force them to uncensor it and compel the duel, then it will be an active aspect of the arguments. At which point David's air security at the trade centers, which are essential to his international trades for his country before he constructs the rest of his brokerage kingdom, which requires the previous companies in order to service as an insurance structure until the maturity of the realized perfected full network insurance products. At which point you have the certification of the first 800 billion in profits from the brokerage, which, trading to the second layer for Snapple Facts, includes the specialized aspects of the Libra Tiger character, which includes the entertainment preparation industry, such as shoes, such as clothing, such as makeup, such as hair, such as perfume, etc. At which point these functional positions have a compulsion to the communities that believe that they've been injured by the general government, or communities not blocked by the government, such as the Confederate destruction of their place inside the United States under their hate crime functions, pretending legitimacy in cooperation with the government without service to law. At which point you have a compulsion of those communities to be David's customers so that they can sell him the debts owed to them so that he can service that. At which point they have to build their credit with David in the brokerage so that he'll have confidence to buy the debts owed to them. At which point David taking over the debts owed to them requires the structure of the Confederacy, which develops a part of the layers in David's purchase of the debts. He's only going to do so at the ability to transfer the debts as a product service, which requires the injured communities to construct a Confederate state where David, building the businesses in the blueprints paid for by the profits of the crash of '08 being stopped by David, have to be asserted, at which point their credibility as customers builds their ability to sell the exchange of intent on the brokerage for the building of their interest, which is the construction of the businesses for the Confederacy projected to be in Texas. At which point the long-term systematic example of a customer would be like makeup doesn't really change a lot, so the perfected single individual long-term contracts of delivering a certain quantity of makeup at a particular price for a long period of time can certify a week's worth as a general jar, or a quarter's worth or a year's worth, etc. At which point, their ability to engage in being able to convince David to exchange the blueprints in order for them to acquire their interest to trade the debts owed to them, they would systematically have individual contracts with the makeup, for example, to the 30-year contracts, at which point their 30-year long-term contracts of the high-quality, perfected, overseen, inspected, zombie insurance-proofed, highly vetted, perfected products generates his ability to engage in the leveraging of the long-term promise of the contracts for other systematic interests of the network, at which point it is certified as a network interest so long as they actually believe that they are owed the thing under reprovable injury to David's judges, who then can recommend it at the larger exchanges. The Fed leader around the crash of '08, desperate to solve the crash of '08, needed David to do so, but they demanded that David save the bankers from the crash that was created, at which point David would have to sell them another series of contracts for their reconstruction, at which point their compliance to the larger exchange increases the returns from the crash to David in order to gain compliance from additional order for the additional frequency, generating his ability to make the contracts, or the justification of the contracts, of his confidence under the high insurance structure, generating their reascension under the due time procedure, allowing them to keep more or less the primary same order without the criminal injuries, under a competent series of educated answers as his product services highly invested by his speculators, who are the insurance bond owners, who are the primary riskers, and so their educated answer creates them as teachers and tutors for David and advisors for David, taking all of the risk for the things that they advise as they negotiate the settlement of the construction of the total network. At which point their development certifies the need to generate the frequency of the 7 layers, at which point they want David to finish the qualifier of the business layer to be able to get to its 800 billion marker as quickly as possible, so that they can sell the contract layer and then they can produce the next one and continue as normal, at which point you have the assumption from the projections that the 800 billion sold as a business opportunity goes into the next layer as seed money for the next layer, and once they've acquired the agreement of having profited from the business layer from the 800 billion according to the agreements, then it defaults back to David as he is the rightful owner, and they are just temporarily taking over for the profits with the right to contracts. It's David brokering the exchange of their rights to contracts or working for the particular projected profits, generates the status quo function of the Legend of David character, generating their ability to profit from these exponentially, builds up to the 7 layers, at which point the 7 layers contributing to David would default after the 6th layer would have satisfied all of the previous profits to those who have engaged in the previous layers, having proven the legitimacy of the original 800 billion promise. Looking to re-up the exchange would then upgrade from the promise of the 800 billion to the purchase of the credit, at which point they would be credited the profits from the businesses after that, at which point they would be paying it at the normal credit card payment, which, if they had done so competently, could easily be projected. One of the projections that I saw said like 16 to 18, so we'll say 17% at which point their consistent profits generated allows for the status quo payment of the interest as they're constantly trading the contracts and working normally, at which point their development of the creation of status by the bonus credit system generates the frequency of their interest to the network, which improves their status, which includes their influence and their ability to negotiate things, which certifies the various stages of how important they are to David up to his civilians, at which point the function of him building civilians in his country generates the position of nobles, at which point if they've ascended to the top, then they have asserted themselves as a noble of David's country. Having asserted themselves as a noble of David's country, they would be able to place themselves in one of the various treaty state republics where they would do normal republic functions, and that just generates the popular government from those who have asserted themselves as nobles, generating the structure of his kingdom, and the various republics from each treaty service under the kingdom as the federal government of David's kingdom over the various states is just a federal government under a constitutional kingdom from that projection. Now, their development as importance derived by how frequently they engage in customer functions improves their status quo engagement under the contracts, such as their projected long-term agreements for their business development, such as, but it's not limited to, the contract of David acquiring the agreement with the hydrogen vehicles, which was projected to be a network stable function, at which point the hydrogen vehicles creates permanent generation of hydrogen, probably from eco-friendly exchanges such as nuclear, at least in the beginning, until they come up with a more permanent answer, at which point you have the function of using the status quo vehicles such as gas and diesel until the trading functions for that system is able to build the hydrogen fuel centers, along with the development of replacing the gas and diesel with the hydrogen vehicles, at which point you have a constant commercial transportation system under the purely hydrogen function generating the profits, which on the chart will have its ups and its downs and its exchanges between David and the owners of that property or those companies, generating the position which is assumed to settle with David having 30% on the basis of his services of their company as a part of the contract value of having paid for his services, at which point David owning 30% of their company after the expansions is perfectly acceptable to the development of their place, at which point they would be developing themselves as customers within that system under the contract schedule, which develops their place in being able to assert the diversity of their business accolades or interests, such as, but is not limited to, the function of David taking over the oil companies for the oil trust of the 1.2 trillion projection under the schedule from his investigation as intelligence oversight of the wizard communists subverting the market. The existence of the Americans having control doesn't mean the criminals don't exist, at which point they still have to conduct their crimes, which means the government still has to engage in its normal procedures and investigations in order to produce the capture in question, at which point the damages from the market would be subverted under their projection, at which point it is not insider trading because he is stopping a criminal action, at which point it is just a function of the government under the government's security contract with David, which includes his economic security, which Lindsey Graham's character targeted David as his economic security, generated the obligation of the Confederates to upgrade into a hot war against the Americans when overthrowing the legal government in order to engage in the assertion of the Great Reset and then the collapse of the rest of the world under the Confederacy, generating that general plot, at which point David compelling them into violence is based upon David as a child beating trained adults or man children who, having all of the resources of the United States government from their insurgencies, would have still been intellectually inferior to a child, which makes perfect sense when you know them. At which point you have the assertions of the various interests inside the network, which requires the customers and injured and partners and associates and etc. to complain to the government for the obstructions. So if you're going to default, say, the broad issue, which is overly broad, of the black community being injured as a collective thing, which isn't always going to be true, but we'll just say it for the example. Their interest, if their claim is to sell the debts owed to them, requires them to build themselves as customers, at which point they are automatically going to have to complain in order to engage in their social development. Now, when the world wars happened, you had the Rosie the Riveters or whatever create the women taking over the factories in the general market, which gave them money, which gave them political influence, and so they had more leverage to make their various exchanges, which is what those communities would be looking for if they were selling the debts. They want more influence in political exchanges, at which point a more potent power dynamic compels them to exchange with David in order to assert themselves as respected members of the political community, which allows themselves to provide competent, educated answers through David's political party, which developing his political social media includes the functionality of having organized the educated answer of the network and their personal interests from their submission of their definitions on what they want from the brokerage. So their definitions or wishes, which they purchase the construction of research in order to find, so that they can assert various desirable paths in order to acquire what they want, allows them to construct this under the brokerage, at which point their ascension requires them to complain for David's restoration, as David was stolen from them for these injuries, at which point they are liable to file the claims and protest publicly for the influence to be returned to them from the original market in the modern day, which isn't 30 years ago, which isn't 10 years ago, which isn't 3 months ago. It's today, it's this week, it's the modern, in-life, breathing, current modern exchanges owed to them immediately, which they have been actively encouraged to avoid under the threat of the Confederates and the various tricks by the KKK insurrectionists as the militia of the Confederacy, to engage in them not doing things that will systematically work, at which point they could be insulted and diminished on the basis of their incompetence, as the things that they're allowed to do are not designed to be able to work. At which point, if they do not complain for the restoration of David Bull's relationship with them, then they will be permanently restrained to these criminal conditions and continue to suffer. Now, if they are, by definition, not owed those things, as they would not be the victims of any various crimes, then they wouldn't have a claim, and then they would act normally. But if someone isn't owed something, they won't act like they're owed it. They're going to say whatever they want to say, but they're not going to behave like it's owed to them because they don't feel that it is. And if it is owed to them, they're going to behave like it's owed to them. So they're going to work actively under the coercion towards the thing that they feel that they're owed in order to acquire a material benefit, unless they're not owed it, in which case they have no reason to assert their efforts toward developing it to maturity. At which point, the question of whether or not it's fraud that they're owed something is derivative of the collective proofs, such as their investment into David Bull's and their development of status with David Bull's network, asserting their place in the original economy, as David is the leading mechanism for the capitalist exchange, which was barred by the Confederate wizard terrorists, which have systematically been conducting hate crimes against them, such as the social engineering and the economic sabotage by the economic hitmen in the various developments of their subversion of their communities by making them do the wrong things so that they would not acquire stability, as racism is fundamental to the Confederacy, and the collapse of the projected slaves requires the cooperation of those slaves who had otherwise been freed by the assertion of the excess power. So the injured communities from political identity, in the political identity of the identity politics, generates the natural weaknesses of their community, which have to be asserted in a specific competent order, or there is no frequency to development of their desired outcomes inside the collective community, at which point they will behave normally or they will accept the social engineering into the inferior position, asserting their desire to develop themselves under those political influences. They will assert themselves as complaining about the obstruction of their relationship to David Bowles and his systems, asserting the power dynamics from the original arrangements, as David is the patriarchy and extremely wealthy and essential to their being respected in the general community. And the exchanges of the Confederacy and the different factions with each other have only provided them lip services or fake developments under the assertion that they, falling into the trap, can be collapsed into their slave roles at a future date, at which point the passive white liberal is the most destructive thing to the black communities, is based upon them being an essential aspect of the trap to destroy those peoples out of pure malice or hatred for those communities by the apathy and compliance towards their collapse in those traps from those systematic arrangements, in order to develop them into the socially engineered conformed position, similar to how it is normal to treat women under the social engineering in order to shame them into compliance, which generates their willingness to tolerate bad behavior, such as the rape culture's trade of the rape contracts for the rape culture, which is generated for profits on the black market by the Confederacy, funding their illegal programs, such as the structure of the black market, or the funding of their criminal war, such as the overthrowing of the republics by the Confederate insurgency, who are protecting the crime market, who are blocking prosecutions of the Confederate double agents, who are functioning under the crime market, generating the profits for the corruption investment, which collapses the popular government into the abuse structure of the racist system that is the Confederacy.